I stood under the stage lights in a baggy black dress my sister forced on me. Gripping the microphone, she smirked at the elite crowd, auctioning her own flesh and blood for $1 as a cruel joke. The ballroom erupted in laughter. Then a stranger in the back stood up and spoke a number that froze every champagne glass in midair. The terrifying part for her was not the $1 million. He knew exactly who I was. My name is Natalie Thomas. I am 34 years old. And right now, I am standing under the blinding glare of a 1,000-watt spotlight, being auctioned off like a discarded piece of furniture. The grand ballroom of the Halcyon Meridian Hotel in the heart of Greyhaven was a breathtaking spectacle of winter opulence. The annual Winterbridge Renewal Trust Winter Fundraising Gala was the absolute pinnacle of the social calendar, an exclusive event where the city elite gathered to flaunt their staggering wealth under the thin guise of philanthropy. Tonight, the vast hall had been transformed into a frozen wonderland. Giant crystal chandeliers shaped like cascading icicles threw fractured. Prismatic light across dozens of round tables draped in heavy silver silk. Towering centerpieces of white roses and frosted branches scraped the painted vaulted ceiling. The air was thick and heavy, a suffocating mixture of roasted duck, vintage champagne, and the sharp, arrogant perfume of old money and new greed. I was never supposed to be on this stage. For the past few hours, I had been relegated to the shadows of the utility corridors, running logistics in the background, making sure the caterers stayed strictly on schedule and the silent auction items were properly displayed under the security lights. But the main charity auction had hit a sudden, uncomfortable lull. The auctioneer had lost the rhythm. The crowd of wealthy donors was growing remarkably restless, their attention drifting away from the stage and back to their crystal glasses and hushed. Venomous gossip. The energy in the room was rapidly dying. That was exactly when my older sister, Elise Cartwright, decided the evening desperately needed a spark of cruel entertainment to jolt the room back to life. I did not even see her coming. Her perfectly manicured fingers clamped around my upper arm like a steel vise, her sharp acrylic nails biting painfully into my skin through the rough, cheap fabric of my dress. It was a hideous, oversized black garment, deliberately chosen by Elise to make me look completely formless, a stark and pathetic contrast to her own custom crimson gown that swept the floor with liquid, terrifying grace. She yanked me out from the safety of the backstage wings, dragging me directly into the center of the stage, right into the brutal, unforgiving circle of the main spotlight. I stumbled forward, my cheap shoes slipping on the polished wood, but Elise held me up, her grip bruising my flesh. She grabbed the microphone from the startled auctioneer with her free hand, her teeth flashing in a brilliantly fake, high society smile that she had painstakingly perfected over years of ruthless social climbing. She leaned into the mic, her voice dripping with that polished, venomous sweetness she reserved solely for her most vicious moments. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elise purred, the sound booming out of the massive concert speakers and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We seem to be losing our momentum here tonight. So, for our final, unscheduled lot of the evening, I present to you a truly unique opportunity, a live-in family maid, personal assistant, and general burden, currently seeking a new master to sublease her to." The entire ballroom erupted into a chorus of surprised, cultured laughter. The sound hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. I stood completely frozen, my vision blurring gray at the edges. My right hand was buried deep in the right pocket of that monstrous black dress. My fingers were clamped white-knuckle tight around two concealed objects, a small black leather-bound notebook and a cold, heavy metal USB drive. They were the only things anchoring me to reality in that terrifying, surreal moment. I pressed them hard against my thigh, feeling the rigid spine of the notebook and the sharp edge of the drive cut into my palm. They were my salvation and my absolute weapon, the culmination of countless sleepless nights and months of silent, agonizing endurance. I focused entirely on the rough texture of the leather, trying desperately to steady my erratic breathing while the wave of cruel amusement rolled through the cavernous room, threatening to drown me completely. Down in the front row, bathed in the soft, golden glow of the VIP table centerpieces, sat Nolan Cartwright, Elise and her seemingly perfect husband. He was swirling amber liquor in a heavy crystal glass, leaning back in his plush velvet chair with a lazy, predatory grin plastered across his handsome face. "Come on, Elise," Nolan shouted over the chuckles, his voice booming with the arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he owned half the room and everyone sitting in it. "You have to tell them the full truth. She cannot even make a decent double espresso without crying about it in the kitchen. You should be paying someone a salary just to take her off our hands." The crowd roared with fresh delight. The sycophant sitting at his VIP table slapped the crisp white linens in hysterics, raising their expensive glasses in his direction. The humiliation was a crushing, suffocating weight, pressing down heavily on my chest, making it entirely impossible to draw a full breath. I stared blankly out at the sea of blurred, laughing faces, feeling like an animal trapped in a snare, living a nightmare I could not wake up from. Elise laughed lightly into the microphone, a delicate, bell-like sound that made my stomach violently turn over. Now, Nolan, let us be fair to my dear sister. She tries her very best, even if her very best is consistently and tragically disappointing. She paced a few steps around me, presenting me to the audience like a defective prize horse at a livestock fair. "So, let us start the bidding at an appropriate level, a level perfectly fitting for someone who only knows how to ruin every single opportunity ever handed to her. Do I hear $1? Just one single dollar for the invisible assistant? Anyone willing to spare a single bill?" The laughter peaked, transforming into a deafening cacophony of wealth and pure, unadulterated cruelty. The massive television cameras streaming the gala live to the internet were focused dead on my burning, humiliated face. I stared straight ahead at the heavy, carved oak doors at the back of the hall, wishing desperately that the polished marble floor would simply open up and swallow me deep into the earth. And then, it happened. A sound cut through the noise of 1,000 laughing billionaires like a rifle crack. $1 million. The voice was a deep, incredibly resonant baritone. It did not shout, yet it carried an absolute, terrifying authority that instantly commanded the vast, echoing hall. The words were spoken with a cold, hard precision that stripped the oxygen straight out of the room. It came from the very back of the ballroom, near those towering arched doorways I had just been staring at. The laughter died in a fraction of a second. The transition from roaring amusement to absolute stillness was so violent it felt like emotional whiplash. The silence that instantly followed was so profound, so incredibly heavy, that I could clearly hear the low, electric hum of the massive lighting rig suspended 40 feet above the stage. Every single head in the halcyon meridian turned simultaneously, a massive wave of diamonds and silk shifting in perfect unison. The camera operators, trained to instinctively follow the highest bids for the live broadcast, panicked. They whipped their heavy, mechanical lenses away from the stage, motors whirring loudly in the dead quiet room, and zoomed straight toward the darkness at the back of the hall. A man stepped forward from the deep shadows into the soft, warm wash of the ambient aisle lights. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that made every other man in the room, including Nolan, look like a clumsy child playing dress-up in his father's closet. His posture was rigid, his jaw set in a line of pure granite. His dark gaze was sharp enough to cut through solid glass. He did not look at Elise, who was standing right beside me with her jaw practically unhinged in shock. He did not spare a single, fleeting glance for the stunned, pale faces of the Greyhaven elite whispering frantically at their expensive tables. $1 million, he repeated, the words rolling over the dead silent room like an approaching thunderstorm. But not to buy her. He took another slow, highly deliberate step down the center aisle, the sharp click of his leather shoes echoing sharply off the marble floors. His eyes bypassed the glittering crowd completely, They bypassed my sister entirely. They locked dead onto me. More specifically, his piercing gaze dropped straight down to my right hand. He stared directly at the exact spot where my hand was buried deep in my dress pocket, right where the small black notebook bulged slightly against the thin, cheap fabric. He stared at that specific pocket with a terrifying, hungry intensity. He looked exactly like a dangerous man who had just walked into a crowded room and finally found the one incredibly valuable thing he had been mercilessly hunting for months. 18 months ago. The world as I knew it completely shattered. It was a Tuesday in the dead of winter. The kind of bitter, unforgiving cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. In a single afternoon, the judge finalized my divorce, severing a hollow marriage that had bled me dry emotionally and financially. Less than 4 hours later, Human Resources at Asterline Risk Forge called me into a sterile, windowless office. They handed me a cardboard box and a severance package that barely covered a month of groceries. The company was restructuring. They said, my position as a senior financial risk analyst was eliminated. Just like that. 10 years of climbing the corporate ladder vanished into thin air. I had nowhere else to go. The blizzard hit Greyhaven that evening, burying the city streets under feet of heavy, wet snow. I stood on the massive, columned porch of my sister's sprawling suburban estate, shivering violently inside a thin wool coat. I had exactly one battered suitcase, an outdated laptop carrying my ruined portfolio, and a shattered sense of self. I rang the doorbell, praying for a shred of sibling warmth. Elise opened the heavy oak door. She was dressed in pristine white cashmere, holding a crystal glass of expensive red wine. She did not open her arms for a hug. She did not ask if I was freezing, or if I was okay, or how I was holding up after losing my husband and my career on the exact same day. She simply stood in the warm, golden light of her grand foyer, looking down at my snow-covered boots with thinly veiled disgust. She told me I could stay in the spare space, on the strict condition that I knew my place and made myself exceedingly useful. There was no discussion of healing or getting back on my feet. There were only the family rules. The spare space was not a guest bedroom. It was a cramped, windowless utility closet situated right between the laundry room and the heated 5-car garage. It smelled permanently of industrial bleach and motor oil. The single twin bed barely fit against the cinder block wall. In exchange for this miserable shelter, I became the unpaid, invisible staff of the Cartwright household. My days began at 5 in the morning and rarely ended before midnight. I scrubbed the marble floors, picked up dry cleaning, managed the grocery deliveries, and spent hours prepping mind-numbing logistics for Elise's luxury event planning business. Nolan made sure I never forgot how far I had fallen. He would walk through the massive kitchen in his custom silk suits, dropping his empty coffee mugs directly in front of me while I was scrubbing the granite countertops. He found endless amusement in my degradation. He would smirk and loudly point out how tragic it was that a woman who used to crunch complex financial algorithms for a living was now strictly relegated to folding linen napkins into perfect swans for his dinner parties. He called me a burden, a charity case, a cautionary tale of failure. He never missed a chance to remind me that without them, I would be freezing on the streets. It did not take long for me to realize the ugly truth about my sister. Elise had absolutely no intention of helping me rebuild my life. She did not want me to recover. She wanted to keep me entirely dependent, entirely broken, trapped in this degrading role. Having me scrub her floors and fetch her coffee allowed her to play the magnanimous, successful older sister to her wealthy friends, while privately feeding her deep-seated superiority complex. She was the savior, and I was the pathetic, helpless charity case. Every time she had guests over, she would loudly sigh and mention how hard it was to take care of family in crisis, soaking up their praise while I washed their dishes in the next room. Her sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion became a psychological prison designed to steadily erode every last ounce of my self-esteem. I was surrounded by breathtaking luxury, yet I ate the leftover catering food standing up in the pantry. I was entirely isolated, treated less like a human being and more like a defective appliance. The sheer exhaustion of the physical labor was meant to break my spirit, to keep me too tired to ever look for another job or plan an escape route. I was losing my voice, my identity, and my pride. But Elise made one critical, fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because my spirit was bruised, my mind was broken, she forgot what I used to do for a living. A senior risk analyst is trained to see the things that other people desperately want to keep hidden. My entire career at Asterline Risk Forge was built on finding the tiny, imperceptible fractures in massive walls of data. I was trained to look at a sea of numbers and spot the single drop of poison. Even while I was exhausted, even while I was numb, that analytical part of my brain never turned off. It was a survival instinct. I observed everything. I watched the way the household operated, the way the vendors came and went, the way the money flowed through the extravagant events Elise hosted. I noticed the tiny details that a maid would ignore, but an auditor would flag. Eventually, Elise got lazy, because she viewed me as nothing more than a mindless servant. She started handing off her tedious administrative work to me, late at night, sitting on my lumpy mattress in the utility room. I was tasked with logging her event expenses, organizing donor thank you envelopes, and updating the master transfer schedules for the charity galas. She gave me access to the surface-level ledgers, thinking I was too defeated to actually read what I was typing. At first, it was just mindless data entry. But then, my eyes caught a discrepancy. It was a tiny thing, just a strange repetition of a specific billing code. I brushed it off. But 2 nights later, I saw it again. Then I noticed the invoices. The vendor names were different, but the formatting, the font, and the payment terms were entirely identical. I started looking closer at the envelopes I was sealing. The addresses for 3 separate supply companies all traced back to the exact same empty commercial lot on the outskirts of the city. I sat in the freezing utility room, the harsh fluorescent light buzzing above my head, staring at the glowing screen of my old laptop. The humiliation and exhaustion suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp rush of adrenaline. The numbers were talking to me, whispering a story that Elise and Nolan thought was perfectly buried. I looked at the transfer schedules again. The amounts were too perfectly rounded, moving through accounts at highly specific times that avoided standard banking flags. They had handed the keys to their destruction right into the hands of the woman they treated like dirt. I pulled a small, blank black notebook from my suitcase and clicked my pen. I began to write. The days bled into the nights until the concept of time lost all meaning inside that sprawling, suffocating house. As soon as the sun went down, and my back-breaking domestic duties were supposedly finished, my second agonizing shift began. I was drafted as the ghost assistant for Ivory Row Events, the highly lucrative boutique planning firm my sister owned and operated from her pristine home office. My designated workspace was a wobbly, plastic folding table shoved mercilessly into the darkest corner of the walk-in pantry, surrounded by towering shelves of imported dry goods and the heavy scent of bulk spices. From 8 o'clock in the evening until 2 or sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning, the harsh overhead light burned my exhausted eyes. I sat on a hard wooden stool, cross-referencing endless, dizzying columns of wealthy donor responses and drafting hundreds of personalized, fawning thank you letters to the city elite. Yet, whenever an email was meticulously finalized, perfectly proofread, and ready to be sent to the clients, Elise would materialize out of nowhere. She would loom heavily over my aching shoulder, her sharp manicured finger aggressively tapping the mouse to delete my signature block. She swiftly replaced my name with hers, or a generic administrative title, ensuring my existence remained completely and utterly erased from the professional world. Nolan made absolutely sure the severe physical exhaustion I felt was matched perfectly by relentless psychological warfare. He possessed a terrifying, almost artistic talent for inventing meaningless, degrading tasks just to watch me break a sweat and swallow my pride. If I had just finished carefully polishing the expensive glassware for an intimate private dinner he was hosting, he would casually stroll into the dining room, He would pick up a heavy crystal flute, hold it up to the blazing light of the chandelier, and falsely claim he saw a microscopic smudge near the rim. With a condescending sigh, he would force me to rewash the entire delicate set of 40 glasses by hand, while the hired caterers stood by and watched in awkward, humiliating silence. On the frantic days I prepared the intricate seating charts, he would walk by and casually rip up the freshly printed place cards. He would claim the specific font style I chose looked entirely too poor and desperately cheap for his high-caliber guests, forcing me to reprint and hand-cut over 100 new, heavy cardstock tags, a mere 20 minutes before the front doors opened. It was a cold, calculated, daily ritual deliberately designed to keep my head bowed low and my eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. But keeping my eyes down meant I was always looking directly at the paperwork. My mind, starving for any complex puzzle to solve, latched fiercely onto the sprawling financial ledgers I was ordered to digitize. It started quietly with the logistics costs. I noticed a recurring, bizarre expense simply labeled as site transportation. The financial figures were never clean. Round numbers, they were always something highly specific and strange, like $4,872.15. The truly alarming part was not the strange amount, but the rigid frequency. Every single Tuesday afternoon, precisely at 3 o'clock, a payment for that exact odd amount was processed and cleared. The payee company name changed predictably every 3 weeks, cycling through vaguely corporate titles like Apex Hauling, Summit Transit, and Vista Logistics, but the routing numbers and transfer patterns remained entirely identical. My professional curiosity deepened significantly when I had to reconcile the physical delivery manifests with the digital invoices stored on the local drive. The vendors sounded completely legitimate on the heavy, embossed official letterheads Elise provided for my data entry. However, when I secretly mapped out the delivery routes during my short breaks, the geography made absolutely no logical sense. A prominent company supposedly shipping premium, perishable floral arrangements from a massive coastal warehouse was listed at a billing address that, according to the city zoning maps I checked on my phone, was actually a dilapidated, abandoned strip mall 30 miles inland. The next morning, I carefully gathered the conflicting paperwork when I politely asked Elise for the original, physical reimbursement receipts to clarify the conflicting zip codes for the vendor files. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted to freezing. She violently snatched the manila folder right out of my hands, her voice dropping to a dangerous, venomous hiss. She sharply told me she had personally rescued this charity fund from utter administrative chaos, and that I was completely out of line and grossly incompetent for questioning her flawless, meticulous record-keeping. The sheer naked panic violently flashing behind her furious eyes told me everything I needed to know. Immediately after that tense confrontation, Elise explicitly banned me from ever using the lightning-fast primary desktop in her main home office. She forced me to do all the heavy data entry on a sluggish, discarded secondary machine sitting out in the drafty upstairs hallway. She smugly thought she was restricting my access and putting me in my place. In reality, she handed me the ultimate golden key. The older, outdated machine completely lacked the sophisticated, automated data scrubbing software she had installed on her main computer. When I opened the exported financial spreadsheet she sent over the local network connection, the hidden file metadata was completely intact and exposed. I could clearly see the entire digital document history. I could track the exact, specific timestamps showing precisely when original, legitimate figures had been deleted and replaced with inflated numbers. I could easily follow the digital footprints of ghost accounts being rapidly created and subsequently dissolved within a matter of mere minutes. I retreated to my tiny, freezing utility closet late that night, locked the thin door, and pulled out my small black notebook from beneath my mattress. I completely abandoned writing in plain English, terrified that Nolan might conduct one of his random, invasive searches of my meager belongings while I was cleaning the garage. Instead, I fell back entirely on the complex shorthand codes and obscure auditing symbols I had developed over my decade working in high-level corporate risk analysis. A dark circle meant a phantom address, A sharp triangle denoted a duplicated, fraudulent invoice. A jagged dashed line accurately mapped the hidden flow of stolen funds. Page by page, night after night, I built a silent, absolutely irrefutable map of their massive deception. As I finally cross-referenced the raw, unscrubbed metadata with the master budget for the upcoming Winter Gala, the final, horrifying picture snapped into crystal-clear focus. The ultimate target was the Winterbridge Renewal Trust. Massive corporate donations originally intended for struggling community grants were not just going missing. They were being systematically and ruthlessly sliced into smaller, unnoticeable fractions. Hundreds of separate payments of exactly $9,900 were flooding out to the various shell companies. The amounts were meticulously calculated to stay just underneath the strict $10,000 threshold that would automatically trigger a mandatory internal financial audit. They were bleeding the vital charity dry one small, calculated cut at a time, and they were using my exhausted keystrokes to facilitate the entire crime. The quiet hours before dawn became my strategic war room. The damp utility space was always freezing, but my mind was burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. I was no longer just surviving the daily humiliation. I was actively hunting. I started piecing together the fragmented financial reality of the event planning business and the charity foundation. My old laptop remained strictly disconnected from their home internet network. I relied entirely on the disjointed digital scraps I managed to salvage during my grueling late-night data entry shifts. I captured blurry photographs of draft spreadsheet files on my phone right before Elise would inevitably rush in to scrub the sensitive columns. I smoothed out crumpled shipping receipts I secretly fished out of the heavy recycling bins in the garage. But the most damning pieces of the puzzle came from an incredibly mundane source. Elise demanded I digitize Nolan's meticulous handwritten mileage logs for his luxury vehicle to maximize their annual tax deductions. By cross-referencing the timestamps on the draft charity spreadsheets with the GPS coordinates and transit times from his driving logs, a completely different, highly incriminating geography emerged. I carefully mapped out the 3 mysterious logistics vendors that were constantly draining the charity accounts through slightly altered invoices. On paper, they were distinct corporate entities operating in entirely different sectors of the supply chain, but when I traced their registered business addresses using public tax records on my cellular network, the elaborate illusion completely collapsed. All 3 companies leased the exact same square footage inside a desolate, windowless storage warehouse located in an abandoned industrial park on the edge of the county. Furthermore, they all routed their supposed profits through the exact same obscure intermediary accounting firm situated 2 towns over. It was a classic, textbook shell game designed to create a maze of fake paperwork. The truly sickening revelation hit me 3 nights later. I managed to isolate a specific string of expedited payments explicitly earmarked as emergency winter relief supplies for the struggling homeless shelters downtown. I tracked the routing numbers as the funds left the charity trust, bounced briefly into the bank account of the warehouse shell company, and were instantly wired out again. The final destination was a private equity holding group. I instantly recognized that specific corporate name. Nolan had loudly boasted about it during a lavish dinner party weeks prior, swirling his expensive scotch while I served the appetizers. That holding group was the primary financial vehicle funding his highly leveraged, severely struggling luxury condominium development project. The massive sums of money meant for freezing families were directly subsidizing his failing real estate empire. My hands shook violently over the keyboard. The overwhelming urge to grab my winter coat, run to the nearest police precinct, and blow their entire fraudulent world apart almost consumed me. But years of strict corporate risk assessment training forced me to breathe slowly and calculate the odds. If I walked into a precinct with nothing but my own handwritten notes and a few blurry photos on a phone, Elise would annihilate me. She was a master manipulator with deep, established ties to the city elite and the local authorities. She would instantly spin a tragic public narrative, painting me as a bitter, deeply unstable, and vindictive woman lashing out in jealousy after a messy divorce. She would bury me under high-priced defamation lawsuits before a single financial detective ever looked at her ledgers. I needed armor that could not be pierced by her lies. I waited until my assigned weekly grocery run. I drove my rusted car to a crowded supermarket far outside our usual wealthy neighborhood and used a grimy public payphone to call Mara Keene. Mara and I had survived the exact same grueling finance law courses in college. While I went into the corporate risk sector, she became a ruthless, highly feared civil litigation lawyer who specialized specifically in corporate and nonprofit financial fraud. Hearing her sharp, familiar voice was like throwing a heavy lifeline to a drowning woman. I quickly outlined the shell companies, the false invoices, and the undeniable real estate connection. Mara was totally silent for a long moment before delivering her professional verdict. Her instructions were sharp, pragmatic, and incredibly strict. She explicitly forbade me from doing anything that crossed a legal boundary. I was not to attempt guessing administrative passwords. I was not to hack into the main computer network. And I was absolutely forbidden from breaking into the locked filing cabinets in the home office. She warned me that any evidence obtained through unauthorized access would be instantly thrown out of civil court and could easily land me in a jail cell. I had to rely solely on the data I was legally exposed to during the course of my daily chores. I could only use the physical documents Elise willingly handed me to file, the schedules I was explicitly ordered to manage, and the emails I was instructed to draft. I returned to the sprawling house and completely restructured my approach. I created a secure, encrypted offline database on my battered laptop. I backed up every single digital entry by hand in my small notebook using my proprietary auditing shorthand. I named this entire parallel system the Black Ledger. It was a living, breathing blueprint of their corruption, built entirely from the breadcrumbs they carelessly dropped right in front of me. During a brief, hurried phone call 3 days later, Mara gave me the most vital piece of legal strategy I had received so far. She told me that simply proving the charity money was missing was only a fraction of the battle. Any competent defense attorney would just blame a faceless, rogue vendor or claim a phantom hacker compromised the system. To truly destroy them and guarantee a conviction, she said, I had to prove 3 specific things with absolute, undeniable certainty. I had to prove exactly who had explicit prior knowledge of the fraud, who physically authorized the illicit bank transfers, and who ultimately pocketed the stolen funds. I thought I was merely a silent observer gathering ammunition. I thought I was safely hidden in the background, carefully weaving my net in the shadows while they ignored me. I was entirely wrong. The following morning, Elise handed me a massive stack of finalized printed reimbursement reconciliations. She casually ordered me to file them away in the heavy, fireproof archive cabinets down in the basement. The air in the basement was damp and smelled strongly of old paper and dust. I sat on the cold concrete floor, mindlessly organizing the thick manila folders by chronological date. I opened a folder specifically labeled for the upcoming Winter Gala logistics. I pulled out a heavy parchment document authorizing a massive, expedited cash transfer to the exact shell company funneling money to Nolan's condominiums. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page, looking for the sweeping, arrogant signature Elise always used. My heart completely stopped. The blood drained rapidly from my face, leaving me feeling violently dizzy and sick to my stomach. Elise had not signed the fraudulent authorization. Sitting right there on the final approval line, perfectly rendered in dark black ink, was my exact electronic signature. Seeing my own electronic signature perfectly forged at the bottom of that fraudulent transfer document should have broken my spirit completely. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. Elise had not just stolen my dignity and my professional confidence. She was actively and meticulously framing me for a massive federal financial crime. If the state auditors ever came knocking on the heavy oak doors of the Cartwright mansion, she had arranged the digital paperwork with terrifying precision to ensure I would be the only one dragged out of the house in handcuffs. For a few agonizing minutes, sitting on the cold concrete floor of the damp basement, I let the raw, suffocating terror wash over me. But then, something deep inside my chest fundamentally shifted. The paralyzing fear evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. I was no longer the broken, weeping divorcee begging for a warm place to sleep. I was a senior risk analyst, and my older sister had just made the catastrophic mistake of giving me full, unrestricted access to the center of her crime scene. Instead of confronting her and foolishly showing my hand, I leaned into my subservient role harder than ever before. I kept my head bowed low, my voice softer than a whisper, and my posture utterly defeated. I scrubbed the grout in the master bathroom until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. All while meticulously calculating my counteroffensive, I began constructing a flawless, legally watertight evidence timeline. Every single time Elise barked a verbal order or forwarded me an email instructing me to process a shady payment, I secretly logged the exact hour, minute, and second in my encrypted file. I cross-referenced her verbal commands with the digital login times on the secondary computer, proving definitively that I was only acting under her direct, supervised instruction. Mara and I spoke in hushed, urgent tones over secure public payphones located miles away from my sister. She helped me draft a comprehensive, devastating legal affidavit. We did not file it with the civil courts yet, because timing in litigation is absolutely everything. She painstakingly instructed me on the exact chain of custody required for the digital metadata and the physical shipping receipts to ensure every single page of my black ledger would be fully admissible before a strict judge. I knew I needed to test the waters outside the suffocating, luxurious walls of the Cartwright estate. I needed to know if the philanthropic community of Greyhaven was ready to hear the ugly truth. Using a heavily encrypted internet connection at a rundown public library 3 towns over, I started compiling stripped-down, completely anonymous financial analyses. I deliberately removed all specific names and identifying personal details regarding Elise, Nolan, or the Winterbridge Renewal Trust. I focused entirely on the undeniable mathematical patterns of the massive fraud. I detailed the shell company structures, the manipulated invoice routing, and the specific percentages being illegally skimmed from the top of the charitable donations. I signed these explosive reports with a carefully chosen pseudonym, N.T. Gray. I sent them directly to a highly exclusive, fiercely independent ethics advisory board that monitored private wealth donations across the city. The impact was immediate and entirely chaotic. My anonymous reports sent massive shockwaves through the highest echelons of Greyhaven society. The ethics board quietly circulated my findings among the top tier of private donors. The mathematical models I exposed perfectly matched unexplained financial hemorrhages occurring in at least 4 other major charitable funds across the state. The city elite were suddenly terrified that their grand philanthropic legacies were being systematically looted by unseen parasites. I heard whispered rumors during the lavish dinner parties I was forced to cater. The wealthy guests spoke nervously of a mysterious whistleblower who was tearing the cover off a massive, coordinated money laundering syndicate. What they did not know, and what I only realized much later, was that my reports had caught the undivided attention of a very specific, incredibly dangerous man, a man who had spent the last 2 years ruthlessly hunting for the exact financial nexus I had just exposed. He was actively looking for N.T. Gray, knowing perfectly well that whoever possessed that level of granular data was the only person capable of bringing the entire corrupt empire crashing down. Oblivious to the massive storm gathering just outside her perfectly manicured front lawn, Elise grew increasingly drunk on her own manufactured fame. The upcoming Winter Gala was poised to be the absolute crowning achievement of her ruthless social climbing career. As her public profile soared, her private treatment of me became increasingly sadistic and unhinged. She no longer just ignored me. She actively used me as a pathetic prop for her own sick amusement. During her afternoon tea gatherings with the other wealthy wives, she would deliberately spill hot tea on the imported Persian rugs, just to force me to clean it up on my hands and knees while they watched and giggled. She would loudly critique my worn clothing, calling me a tragic charity case in front of women who possess significantly more money than actual empathy. I swallowed the bitter bile in my throat and kept scrubbing the floors, knowing that every single insult she hurled at me only strengthened my iron resolve. The ultimate breaking point arrived late on a Thursday night, exactly 5 days before the grand winter gala. Elise had carelessly left her primary office unlocked. Distracted by a late delivery of imported white orchids, I slipped inside to quickly empty her heavy recycling bin and caught sight of a massive, legally binding corporate sponsorship agreement sitting face up on her polished mahogany desk. It was not a standard charitable pledge form. I quickly scanned the dense legal jargon and the staggering financial figures printed on the heavy parchment. The upcoming gala was not just a fancy party to raise a few $1,000s for the homeless. It was a highly orchestrated, incredibly lucrative theatrical front. Elise was using the charity event to quietly finalize a colossal, multi-million-dollar corporate merger disguised as a philanthropic community endowment. The exact moment the ink dried on that specific contract under the bright gala lights, millions of dollars would instantly flood through her established shell companies. It would effectively wash the stolen funds completely clean and permanently erase every single digital footprint of her previous financial crimes. If that massive deal closed on stage, the meticulous evidence hidden in my black ledger would be rendered completely useless. I had a hard deadline, and it was written in absolute stone. I was going to burn her fake empire to the ground, and I was going to do it in front of the entire city. The psychological warfare inside the Cartwright mansion escalated into a suffocating, invisible pressure cooker. With the grand winter gala merely days away, Elise decided to completely isolate me by delegating the most crucial and exhausting task of the entire operation. She ordered me to set up and manage the backstage war room. It was a chaotic, windowless conference space behind the main ballroom where the true mechanics of the event were orchestrated. For 18 hours a day, I was buried under a mountain of heavy cardstock and glowing screens. I was solely responsible for finalizing the intricate seating charts, meticulously compiling the wealthy donor profiles, stuffing the gold-leafed pledge envelopes, and coordinating the exact minute-by-minute speech schedule for the evening. Elise thought she was burying me under administrative busywork. Instead, she had unknowingly handed me the master architectural blueprints to her entire fraudulent castle. While aggressively cross-referencing the final VIP guest list against the donor histories, a specific name jumped off the glowing screen and made my breath catch sharply in my throat. Gideon Slate. He was not just another arrogant billionaire looking for a tax write-off. In the corporate finance world, Gideon Slate was a terrifying legend. He was a ruthless investor and a highly specialized restructuring advisor for distressed, corrupt funds. He had a fearsome, well-documented reputation for gutting fraudulent boardrooms and exposing massive financial syndicates that the federal authorities could not even crack. I stared at his name for a long time. Was he the mysterious figure who had been quietly tracking my anonymous NT Gray reports? The timing was far too perfect to be a mere coincidence. Yet, I could not afford a single miscalculation. If I exposed myself to him prematurely, and he turned out to be secretly allied with Nolan or the corrupt board members, my entire case would instantly disintegrate. I made a firm, agonizing decision. I would remain a ghost in the shadows until I was absolutely certain of his true allegiances. The tension was not just contained to the spreadsheets. Inside the house, Nolan was growing increasingly sloppy and highly paranoid. He started finding incredibly thin, transparent excuses to linger near my cramped utility closet. He would hover in the hallway, his eyes darting nervously, clearly suspecting that the quiet, broken sister-in-law knew entirely too much about his lucrative shell companies. One afternoon, while I was supposedly scrubbing the marble floor in the master bathroom upstairs, I heard the distinct, agonizingly slow creak of my utility room door hinges. I crept to the landing and looked down. He was systematically tossing my miserable room, aggressively ripping apart my thin mattress and rummaging through my single battered suitcase, desperately searching for anything incriminating. But I was already 10 steps ahead of his arrogant paranoia. The real ammunition was long gone from that house. Mara held the physical, authenticated copies of the forged documents securely locked inside her fireproof legal vault downtown. The raw, unscrubbed digital data was heavily compressed onto a tiny, encrypted USB drive that I had painstakingly sewn deep inside the thick inner lining of my winter coat. All Nolan managed to find was my little black notebook. He flipped through the pages with a deep, frustrated scowl. To his untrained, arrogant eyes, the pages were just filled with meaningless geometric doodles and nonsensical scribbles. My proprietary auditing shorthand perfectly protected the explosive truth. He threw the notebook back onto the floor and left the room empty-handed, but the dangerous suspicion radiating from him only intensified. Elise must have sensed the shifting, volatile energy in the house. She decided to tighten the invisible leash around my neck, using pure, unadulterated psychological terror. She cornered me alone in the massive kitchen late that evening. Her voice dripped with a sickening, fake concern that barely masked a highly lethal threat. She stepped deeply into my personal space, her expensive perfume suffocating me, and quietly told me that if I even dared to think about packing my single suitcase and leaving before the gala was successfully concluded, she would personally destroy my life. She promised to use every single one of her high society connections to ensure my name was permanently blacklisted in every firm, agency, and household in Greyhaven. She coldly stated I would be entirely unemployable, utterly penniless, and forced to sleep on the freezing city streets. I did exactly what I had to do to survive. I shrank back against the cold granite counter, deliberately letting my shoulders slump down in utter defeat. I forced my eyes to well up with perfectly timed, panicked tears. I nodded frantically, playing the exact part of the broken, terrified little sister she desperately needed me to be. Elise smiled. It was a cold, triumphant smirk of a predator who firmly believed she had cornered her prey. She walked away entirely convinced that the heavy steel collar around my neck was securely locked. Her blinding arrogance completely prevented her from seeing the sharp blade I was quietly holding right at her throat. That false sense of security led to her ultimate, fatal mistake. Later that night, while assembling the highly confidential VIP pledge packets in her unlocked home office, I found a misfiled manila folder hidden beneath a stack of blank seating charts. It did not belong to Nolan or his failing real estate shell companies. It was a direct, internal ledger from Ivory Row events. As I rapidly scanned the columns, a second, massive twist slammed into my chest. Elise was not just a passive, ignorant wife looking the other way while her husband stole charity money. She was the active, brilliant architect of the entire social manipulation. I found dozens of direct financial approvals bearing her personal administrative code, explicitly authorizing exorbitant consulting fees. These massive fees were paid directly to the wives of the key charity board members. Elise was literally buying her elite high society status using the stolen philanthropic funds. She was trading money meant for freezing homeless families in exchange for exclusive country club memberships, front row fashion week tickets, and guaranteed glowing press coverage. She knew exactly what Nolan was doing, and she was actively weaponizing the stolen cash to build her own untouchable social empire. The quiet, desperate plan I originally had to simply hand the encrypted USB drive to the authorities and disappear silently into the night completely vanished from my mind. The sheer, calculating evil of her actions extinguished every last drop of familial loyalty I had left. She wanted to use me as a pathetic prop to highlight her fake philanthropy. She wanted to threaten me with absolute ruin. I closed the manila folder and slid it securely into my hidden stash. I was no longer going to leave quietly. I was going to let her entire fraudulent, glittering empire burn to the ground. And I was going to strike the match right where she felt the absolute most powerful, right where she craved blind adoration the most. I was going to destroy her right on the main stage of the gala, under the brightest lights she could possibly afford. 3 days before the event, sleep became an absolute luxury I simply could not afford. The sheer volume of logistical demands Elise piled onto my shoulders was specifically designed to crush my spirit before I even reached the ballroom. I spent 72 straight hours locked in a frantic, exhausting sprint. I assembled the dense financial profiles for the high net worth donors seated at the premier tables, individually wrapped hundreds of crystal favors, and proofread the heavy glossy auction catalogs until my vision violently blurred. The most agonizing task, however, was drafting my sister's keynote address. Elise stood right over my shoulder in the freezing pantry, sharply dictating a heavily emotional, cloying script entirely focused on the profound virtue of human compassion. She demanded I weave in tearful, fabricated anecdotes about empathy and the sacred duty of lifting up the vulnerable in our city. The bitter, staggering hypocrisy of typing those beautiful words for a woman who treated me like an absolute parasite nearly made me physically sick. I swallowed my absolute disgust and polished every single lie until it shined perfectly, knowing those exact words would soon become her public noose. The real breakthrough happened during the chaotic final sweep of the digital folders, while organizing the master logistics drive on the sluggish secondary computer. I spotted a strangely titled encrypted file hidden deep inside a routine catering subfolder. It was a massive corporate sponsorship agreement with the primary donor of the evening. But as my exhausted eyes scanned the dense legal clauses, a terrifying micro-twist slammed my heart directly against my ribs. There was a highly specific, deeply buried execution clause. The colossal influx of corporate funds was not scheduled to be processed the next business day. The money was wired to clear exactly at midnight, directly in the middle of the gala. Even worse, the routing structure mandated an immediate, automated transfer of a massive percentage straight into the primary shell entity controlled by Nolan. They were not just quietly washing the money, they were executing the final, devastating theft live while the wealthy donors clapped and cheered. I pulled out my phone with violently trembling hands and snapped crystal-clear photographs of the execution clause and the specific routing numbers. The deadline was no longer just the end of the night. It was a rapidly ticking clock counting down to midnight. I dragged out my small black notebook and frantically began synthesizing months of complex, coded data. A powerful investor or a federal auditor did not have the time to decipher hundreds of pages of raw metadata during a loud, chaotic party. I distilled the entire black ledger into a brutal, razor-sharp 5-minute executive summary. I mapped the exact shell company structure, the fraudulent invoice loops, and the undeniable proof of Elise directly approving the illicit transactions, fitting the entire explosive truth onto 2 single, easily readable pages. The tension reached a suffocating peak just as we were preparing to leave for the Halcyon Meridian. The chaotic foyer of the estate was packed with heavy garment bags and frantic caterers loading vans. I was standing near the front door, wearing the hideous, oversized dark dress Elise had cruelly selected for me, clutching my canvas tote bag tight against my chest. Nolan suddenly materialized from the hallway, his custom-tailored suit immaculate, his eyes narrowing with that familiar, highly predatory suspicion. Without a single word of warning, he stepped directly into my path and aggressively demanded to inspect my bag, loudly claiming he was looking for a missing stack of valet tickets. My stomach plummeted into a terrifying freefall. The encrypted metal drive holding the entire digital copy of the fraud was sitting completely loose right at the bottom of that canvas tote. He reached out and snatched the bag right from my frozen hands. My mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour. As he roughly yanked the metal zipper open, I feigned a clumsy, panicked stumble forward, deliberately knocking my shoulder hard against a towering stack of freshly printed auction catalogs, resting perilously on the edge of the entryway table. The heavy glossy books cascaded onto the marble floor with a loud, chaotic crash. Nolan instinctively glanced down at the massive mess for a split second. In that single, fleeting moment of distraction, my hand shot blindly into the open tote bag. My fingers grazed the cold metal of the drive. I palmed it seamlessly, instantly withdrawing my hand, just as his angry gaze snapped back up. He dug his hands violently through my makeup bag and spare charging cables, finding absolutely nothing. He shoved the tote back into my chest with a disgusted sneer and barked at me to clean up the ruined catalogs on the floor. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I knelt on the cold marble. The absolute second I was out of his direct line of sight, I slid the small metal drive straight into the thick, rigid spine of my black notebook. I shoved the notebook deep into the right pocket of my ugly dress. It immediately became an extension of my own body, an inseparable, burning weight against my thigh. Just as the hired luxury town car pulled up to the estate, my phone buzzed with a single, encrypted text message from Mara. She confirmed that the emergency civil litigation packets and the priority regulatory alerts were fully finalized and sitting squarely on the desk of a highly aggressive federal judge. She was entirely ready to file the devastating injunctions and freeze the shell accounts the exact second I gave her the green light. The legal trap was perfectly set. I stepped out of the car and into the freezing Greyhaven night, staring up at the blinding lights of the luxury hotel. I only had 2 remaining goals for the entire evening. I had to survive whatever brutal public humiliation my sister had meticulously planned for me. And I had to physically place that 5-minute summary directly into the hands of someone powerful enough to stop the midnight transfer. The Gala was a dizzying, suffocating maze of expensive silk, blinding diamonds, and deafening classical music. I stayed completely in the shadows, running the backstage war room with mechanical precision, my eyes constantly scanning the massive ballroom floor through a small gap in the heavy velvet curtains. The wealthy elite mingled and laughed, entirely oblivious to the massive financial crime happening right beneath their expensive shoes. Then, I saw him. He arrived nearly an hour late, bypassing the flashing cameras of the local press line entirely. He did not move toward the highly coveted honor tables at the front of the room, where Elise was holding court. Instead, Gideon Slate stood near the towering arched doorways at the very back of the hall. He stood perfectly still, a dark, imposing silhouette against the glittering chaos. His sharp gaze slowly swept across the crowded room, analyzing every face, every movement with terrifying calculation. He looked exactly like a highly dangerous predator patiently waiting for a ghost to finally reveal itself in the light. The evening turned uglier by the minute. Elise floated through the room playing queen while reporters followed her, but Gideon Slate quietly rattled her with precise questions about logistics and procurement. I saw the panic flicker in her smile. When the auction lost energy, Elise chose cruelty as her finale. She dragged me under the spotlight, mocked me as a burden, and let Nolan and his friends turn my humiliation into a joke. Then she noticed my hand locked around the notebook in my pocket. She ripped it out. The binding split, and it fell open under the stage lights to my 5-minute summary page, marked with the NT gray cipher. Before she could hide it, a voice cut through the room. $1 million. The laughter died. Gideon Slate walked down the aisle, stepped onto the stage, picked up my notebook, and made it clear he was not bidding on a person. He was making a professional offer for the mind that had just exposed the fraud. He looked at Elise and said she had not brought a maid onto the stage. She had brought the person who was about to dismantle her empire. Watching a room full of billionaires turn on a dime is a lesson in survival. For the previous 20 minutes, they had functioned as a single, cruel organism, feeding eagerly off my public humiliation. But the absolute second Gideon Slate spoke the name N.T. Gray, that unified mob instantly fractured into hundreds of panicked, self-preserving individuals. The transition from roaring, drunken amusement to paralyzed shock was so violent it felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the grand ballroom. Then, the whispering began. It started in the front rows and swept through the massive space like a sudden, freezing wind. The wealthy elite of Greyhaven were ruthless, but they were not stupid. They quickly connected the dots. The pathetic, broken maid standing on the stage was not a tragic burden. I was the anonymous financial ghost who had been quietly terrifying their boardrooms for the past month. Panic is highly contagious, especially when vast sums of money are involved. A silver-haired man at a premier table, the CEO of a major pharmaceutical firm, who had just pledged $200,000, stood up abruptly. He raised his hand flat in the air, signaling the terrified auctioneer to completely halt the proceedings. Several other heavy donors immediately followed suit. Voices began to echo loudly across the room, demanding that all financial commitments be suspended tonight. They wanted to see the raw accounting files right then and there. The glittering facade of the Gala was crumbling in real time. Elise scrambled desperately to regain control of her collapsing empire. She snatched the microphone back, her knuckles turning completely white. She forced a shrill, terrifyingly bright laugh that echoed horribly through the tense room. She told the crowd that Gideon was simply mistaken. She leaned into the vicious smear campaign she had spent weeks carefully laying the groundwork for. She claimed my mind had completely snapped after my brutal divorce. She told the room I was suffering from severe tragic delusions, inventing wild corporate conspiracies to cope with my own pathetic failures. She begged them to ignore my manic scribbles and focus on the beautiful charitable mission of the evening. Gideon did not even blink at her frantic, emotional performance. He completely ignored her shrill voice. He turned his broad shoulders, blocking Elise from my view entirely, and looked directly into my eyes. He did not ask for a tragic backstory or a tearful confession. He simply asked one question in his deep, resonant voice. He asked if I had a 5-minute summary of the fraud. I reached into my pocket and handed him the 2-page summary first, then the black ledger. Then, I stepped around Gideon and calmly took the microphone directly from my sister's trembling hand. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not waste a single breath on dramatic accusations or emotional victimhood. I spoke with the cold, absolute precision of a senior risk analyst presenting a boardroom audit. My voice was steady and remarkably clear. I outlined the exact transaction motifs, explaining how donations meant for winter coats and hot meals were sliced into increments of exactly $9,999. I detailed the fake billing structures used by the 3 shell vendors sharing a single abandoned warehouse on the edge of the county. I traced the circular money routes that bled the charity dry and funneled directly into the private equity holding group funding Nolan and his luxury condominiums. The silence in the room was so absolute, you could hear the hum of the stage lights. I stated clearly that my personal electronic signature had been illegally forged on the transfer authorizations to frame me as the sole perpetrator when the inevitable audit arrived. And finally, I revealed the most damning piece of the puzzle. I detailed the specific administrative approval codes that proved Elise was not just an ignorant bystander, but the active architect who authorized the theft to purchase her elite social standing, trading charity funds for country club memberships. Elise tried to shout over me, lunging forward to grab the microphone, calling me a bitter, jealous liar, but her voice was drowned out by a massive digital failure. I had told Mara Keene exactly when to make her move. She stepped out from the backstage shadows and stood quietly at the edge of the platform. She wore a sharp navy suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase containing the future ruin of my sister. She did not need a microphone. Her presence alone validated every single word I had just spoken. Right at that exact moment, the massive digital projection screen suspended behind the stage, which had been displaying a brightly colored rising thermometer of the night's corporate donations, suddenly flickered and went entirely black. The wealthy crowd gasped in unison. A second later, a glaring red system override message flashed across all 3 massive displays. It was an automated notification directly from the primary banking gateway. A total, immediate freeze had been placed on the midnight mega transfer. Mara had utilized her federal legal channels to preemptively trigger a massive fraud alert through the banking network, locking down every single shell account tied to the Winterbridge Renewal Trust. The multi-million-dollar injection they planned to steal tonight was officially trapped in digital purgatory, down in the VIP seating area. Nolan finally realized the game was entirely over. The arrogant, predatory smirk had completely vanished from his handsome face, replaced by raw, naked terror. He abandoned his expensive crystal glass on the table, practically knocking over his chair, and made a swift, desperate move toward the heavy rear exit doors. He intended to slip away into the night, leaving his wife to face the blast radius. Before the federal authorities arrived, he did not even make it halfway down the center aisle. 3 senior board members, powerful men whose own companies had unwittingly funded his failing real estate projects under the guise of philanthropy, stepped directly into his path. They formed a solid human wall, physically blocking his escape route. Their faces were red with absolute fury. They loudly demanded full clarification and their money back before he took another single step toward the exit. Nolan was completely trapped, stammering pathetic, incoherent excuses to men who possessed the power to ruin him with a single phone call to their lawyers. I stood on the elevated stage, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my sister's fraudulent kingdom. Elise was hyperventilating, her perfect crimson gown looking suddenly absurd, frantically trying to explain herself to donors who were already turning their backs in sheer disgust and walking out of the ballroom. The local reporters who had been photographing her all night were now aggressively shouting questions about federal indictments. I caught Mara's eye across the stage. I looked at the briefcase in her hand, then looked back into her eyes. I gave her a single, firm nod. It was the green light. The official legal process was now fully activated. Mara would instantly file the devastating civil injunctions and hand the evidence packets over to the regulatory boards. The financial ambush was flawlessly executed. The public humiliation was reversed, but as I looked at the pure, venomous hatred burning in my sister's tear-filled eyes amidst the chaos, I knew the true final confrontation had not even begun yet. The ultimate reckoning was scheduled for the morning. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and stale champagne from the Gala had been completely replaced by the sterile, freezing air of the Winterbridge Renewal Trust executive boardroom. I walked through the heavy glass doors flanked by Mara Keene and Gideon Slate. I was no longer wearing an oversized, hideous black dress meant to signify my servitude. I wore a sharp, meticulously tailored charcoal suit that Mara had purchased for me mere hours earlier. I was not entering that room as a disgraced sister, a broken maid, or a tragic burden. I was walking in as a highly specialized expert witness, ready to dismantle a criminal empire. The entire board of directors sat around the massive mahogany conference table. Their faces were gray with a severe lack of sleep and the sheer, overwhelming panic of impending federal audits. At the far end of the long table sat Elise, even now, facing absolute and total ruin. She desperately clung to her carefully fabricated reality. The moment I walked in, she immediately launched into a tearful, trembling monologue. She played the ultimate victim, frantically claiming to the wealthy board members that I was orchestrating a vindictive, elaborate revenge plot because my own marriage and career had failed so miserably. She cried perfect tears, calling me a deeply unwell woman trying to destroy her generous sister. I did not raise my voice to argue with her pathetic performance. I did not show a single ounce of emotional distress. I simply stood at the head of the table, opened a thick leather binder Mara had meticulously prepared, and began to systematically execute my counterattack. I walked the terrified board members through the irrefutable, ironclad timeline of evidence. I used cold, hard facts. I pointed to specific dates and times, showing them the exact hour and minute Elise verbally assigned me tasks or forwarded me the fraudulent invoices. I laid out the raw digital metadata, definitively proving my electronic signature was illegally attached to massive transfer approvals from her primary network node, while I was simultaneously logged onto the sluggish secondary machine in the hallway. I mapped out Nolan's elaborate shell companies step by step, showing exactly how the charity money flowed directly into his failing luxury real estate ventures. Elise tried to interrupt, screaming that Nolan had acted completely alone, that she was just a trusting wife betrayed by her husband. But I immediately silenced her by revealing the most devastating blow of the morning. I presented the internal communications and private ledgers from Ivory Row events. I proved with absolute certainty that Elise was fully aware of the massive theft. Furthermore, she actively approved those abnormal logistics contracts in direct exchange for elite social positioning. She deliberately traded the survival funds meant for freezing homeless families to secure exclusive country club memberships, high society gala sponsorships, and glowing press coverage. Elise slammed her manicured hands flat on the mahogany table, her face flushed red with pure rage, screaming that these were all manipulated, historical documents created by a jealous mind. That was the exact moment the true climax of the reckoning arrived. I turned toward the large digital presentation monitor mounted on the wall and displayed the final, comprehensive synthesis reconciliation. It was not a historical ledger. It was a live system report generated just hours ago during the gala. I showed the board a massive corporate sponsorship transfer that had attempted to automatically divert a huge percentage of the incoming funds directly into Nolan's primary shell company at exactly midnight. However, because of the preemptive legal freeze Mara had instituted through the banking gateway, the transaction was caught dead in the system, flagged bright red, and completely halted. The attempted transfer matched my precise predictive model perfectly. This proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fraud was not past speculation. It was an active, ongoing heist that we had stopped in the very act. The boardroom erupted into total chaos. The chairman of the board, his face pale with fury, immediately called for an emergency vote. In less than 2 minutes, Elise was officially and permanently suspended from all trust activities and stripped of her social titles. Nolan's vendor contracts were frozen instantly. The board voted unanimously to hand the entire mountain of evidence over to the federal authorities and hire independent forensic auditors by noon. As Elise sat entirely paralyzed in her leather chair, her pristine image shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Mara calmly slid a thick legal envelope across the mahogany table. It was a brutal civil lawsuit. Mara clearly announced she was suing Elise and Nolan on my behalf for aggravated forgery, malicious defamation of character, and the unauthorized, exploitative use of highly specialized commercial labor without any fair compensation. We walked out of the boardroom, leaving my sister completely destroyed in the wreckage of her own blinding arrogance. In the quiet, sunlit marble hallway, Gideon Slate stopped and handed me a crisp manila folder. It contained the finalized 12-month exclusive retainer for his advisory firm. The compensation line read exactly $1 million. I looked at him, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion, and thanked him quietly for stepping in and saving me last night. Gideon stopped walking and looked at me with a fierce, uncompromising intensity. He explicitly stated he was not a savior. He told me he was simply paying the fair market rate for an unparalleled professional who possessed the sheer brilliance and immense courage to save herself. Late that evening, I sat in a quiet, upscale hotel room Mara had secured for me, finally breathing clean air. My phone rang. It was Elise. Her voice was entirely unrecognizable, stripped of all its arrogant polish and cruel authority. She was sobbing hysterically, begging for a single chance to fix everything. She frantically claimed she only did those terrible things to keep our family positioned at the very top of high society, saying the pressure to be perfect was simply too much to bear. I listened to her desperate weeping for exactly 1 minute. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no pity, and no lingering familial guilt. I calmly told her that her twisted definition of family was exactly what destroyed her. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I did not soften my heart. I simply hung up the phone and blocked her number forever. 2 weeks later, the morning sun poured warmly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my magnificent new corner office at Slate Covenant Advisory. I stood behind a massive oak desk, breathing in the quiet, absolute freedom of my new life. I held a small, heavy picture frame in my hands. Inside the thick protective glass was not a prestigious university diploma or a meaningless family portrait. It was the battered, worn cover of my black notebook. I hung it squarely on the center of the pristine white wall. It was my permanent reminder. The exact night they tried to strip away my entire humanity and sell me to the highest bidder for $1 was the exact night I violently reclaimed my absolute worth. And this time, nobody else was writing my narrative or defining my value. I defined it myself, using my own true name, Natalie Thomas. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.